State your next witness.
Please call Dr. Down. Can you approach her? Yep.
Please stop you first and talk right here so the clerk will swear you in.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Doctor, if you'd step this way, please. Have a seat in the witness stand.
Good morning, Dr. Downs.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is James Claude Upshaw Downs, MD.
And how are you currently employed?
I work for myself primarily. I am a consultant in medical legal cases, forensic pathology predominantly.
And what do you do mainly by working for yourself as a consultant?
Basically, I have cases that come in where somebody has an injury, for example, and I'm asked to take a look at that to determine, if I can, what happened. Sometimes the individual will be deceased, and I will read an autopsy report, try to figure out, if I can, what happened there. I'll do autopsies. I also work as an associate medical examiner in Gwinnett County, which is suburban Atlanta. I do that about 4 days a month, and 1 day a week I am medical director for the physician assistant program at Charleston Southern University.
And how long have you been consulting on cases?
Started probably 90 or 91.
And are you currently a medical doctor?
I am.
What kind of medical doctor are you?
I'm board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Can you give a brief description of what it means to be board certified in anatomical, clinical, and forensic pathology?
Okay. Let me unpack that a little bit. Pathology is the medicine that uses the laboratory to study disease. And there are two big fields of that. Anatomic pathology, that's the doctor that looks at tissue. So if you had your appendix taken out, the anatomic pathologist would be the doctor that looks at the tissue under the microscope and says, this is why that needed to come out, this is what the problem was. If something untoward happens, then the anatomic pathologist might do an autopsy to determine how this all ended up in the death. Clinical pathologist is the doctor that uses that runs the laboratory. So that says your white count is elevated, you've got this type of bacteria growing in your bloodstream. So forensic takes both of those two disciplines and applies it to cases of sudden, unnatural, unexpected death. Second part of that question is the board certification. That is by an independent board, the American Board of Pathology, which is recognized internationally as a credentialing agency. You have to do a certain amount of training after medical school, after your residency, fellowship. You are allowed to apply to sit for the board exams. And the board exam, anatomic clinical, is 3 days. Forensic is a fourth day. But you apply, you take these exams along with people from all over the country. And if you successfully complete it, it says you've had the requisite training, you've demonstrated your performance, and we deem that you're competent to be credentialed.
Can you give a brief explanation as to your educational background and how you became to be a board certified pathologist and also board certified in anatomical, clinical, and forensic pathology?
I got my Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry at the University of Georgia. I did my medical school training in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. I also did my residency in anatomic and clinical pathology there in Charleston, as well as my fellowship in forensic pathology also in Charleston. During the course of that training, I also did rotation 1 month in the Dade County, Miami Medical Examiner Department. In addition, I did an internship at the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit in Quantico, Virginia, where I studied sharp force injury and sexual homicides.
Are you a member of any organizations associated with your position as a pathologist?
Quite a few.
And what are some of those?
The major ones would be the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the American Society of Clinical Pathologists, the National Association of Medical Examiners, and the College of American Pathologists, Harvard Association for Police Sciences, American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences. There are others.
And are you currently licensed to practice in any particular states?
I am.
And what states are those?
I'm licensed in South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia.
Before you became a consultant, what did you do prior to that for employment?
I served as a medical examiner for Charleston County. When I was in training, we would moonlight nights and weekends doing exams. So I started that in '89. And basically, I carried that through my entire training process, doing part-time job as a county medical examiner and as a consulting medical examiner for the medical university. Following completion of that training in '94, I moved to Mobile, Alabama, where I was state medical examiner. I was in that capacity for 5 years. I left there because I was named director for the state of Alabama's forensic science lab system, 10 labs, something like 175 employees. Also chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama. Did that for 4 years and kind of missed home, the coast, so I came to Savannah. They opened a lab at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I worked there for 14 years and left government service July of '16, so I've been doing the other stuff ever since.
How many autopsies have you performed?
Personally, I've done upwards of probably 7,500 myself. I've assisted in probably another couple thousand. As chief medical examiner for Alabama, we did something like 3,000 postmortem cases a year. All told, I think it's safe to say I've been part of over 16,000, 17,000 cases.
Do you have any specialized training or experience in the area of sexual homicides?
Yes, ma'am.
And what specialized training or experience do you have?
My internship at Quantico, Virginia, in the behavioral sciences unit, that was primarily focused, this would be the profilers, if you will. They would get the most complicated type cases, many of which were sexual homicides. I studied under Roy Hazelwood, who literally wrote the book Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives. So I was fortunate to train under him and learn about it. And really, nowadays, I really teach those classes more than attend them, but I still occasionally attend seminars and that kind of thing.
So you assist in teaching actual classes regarding sexual homicide?
I guess you could say I assist. I teach primarily, so I'm assisting. If an agency calls me, we might do it as a tag team, but I also teach the classes independent of someone else as well.
Have you published any articles or writings, books in the area of forensic pathology, specifically just looking at forensic pathology?
I've done several. Probably the two biggest publications that I've done in forensic pathology. One is more broadly forensics, that's Ethics in Forensic Science. I'm the senior editor of that book, which is the largest academic book on the subject of forensics and ethics and how ethics apply to my discipline. In addition, I was senior author for the FBI's manual Forensic Investigators Trauma Atlas.
Have you done any specific writings or in the area of sexual homicides?
Within that book, the Forensic Investigator Trauma Atlas, which is for their course Managing Death Investigation, there is a specific chapter in there on sexual homicides.
Have you testified in court previously regarding your work in the area of forensic pathology?
Yes, ma'am.
How many times?
All told, I've given sworn testimony in probably 20 different states, sworn testimony before the committees of the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, before the National Commission of Forensic Sciences. All told, I think it's safe to say hundreds of times. I don't really keep a tab.
Did you say you've testified in different states?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you testified ever in federal court?
I've testified in federal court. I've also testified in military hearings involving the Air Force, the Army, possibly the Coast Guard. I'm involved in a case right now.
Has a court ever refused to allow you to testify?
Not to my knowledge, no, ma'am.
Judge, at this time, I'd ask if defense counsel has any questions in this limited area. Were you contacted by the state attorney's office and asked to consult on a case involving the death of a 9-year-old identified as Felicia Williams?
I was.
Do you recall when you were contacted?
I believe it was August of this year.
And you just testified that you have a special background training experience in the area of sexual homicides. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Was that one particular area you were asked to consult on this case in?
Yes.
Did you also render an ultimate opinion with regards to cause and manner of death in this case?
I did.
What were you provided in order to come to your ultimate opinion in this case?
Provided the records of the medical examiner. That included the report, toxicology reports, a couple of other documents in their file, medical examiner's photographs, in addition about 16 different sets of photographs.
Did you conduct the actual autopsy on the body of Felicia Williams?
I did not.
Are you required or do you need to perform the autopsy on the actual victim in order to render an opinion?
No, actually, that's why the autopsy report exists, is the medical examiner that performs the autopsy documents what they see, and then based on what they see, they render an opinion. But the documentation, the photographs are there so that someone else who's competent and qualified can come along and take a second look.
Did you, upon your completion of review of the documents that you were provided, did you determine whether or not the victim in this case had suffered any injuries?
Yes, I did.
Can you give us a brief overview of the injuries that you opined or that you observed?
I think the most notable thing was the body had multiple superficial injuries. That is, they didn't really go deep in the body, and those are distributed primarily across the front of the face and the chest. There's some lesser injuries, but all of those were post-mortem artifact. That is, they happened after this girl was dead. There were other injuries that were external as well as internal that happened while she was alive. For example, she has some genital injuries. I believe those happened while she was alive. She had some injuries inside her throat that happened while she was alive. She had injuries to her shoulder that happened while she was alive. Injuries to her middle back that happened while she was alive.
Did you observe any injuries about her head?
Yes, there were several bleeds underneath her scalp. Again, those happened while she was alive. She also had some bleeding on the sides of her head that happened while she was alive. Those are associated with the strangulation injuries that I mentioned earlier.
Did you prepare a PowerPoint that would assist you in illustrating and showing the jury where you found these injuries and where they were documented in the photographs?
I did.
Dr. Downs, I'm approaching what's been pre-marked as State's Exhibit JJ for identification purposes. Can you please review this and let me know if you recognize it?
Yes, ma'am.
Is this in fact the PowerPoint presentation that you prepared with regards to this case?
It is.
State offers in evidence, State's Exhibit JJ.
No objection.
Admitted?
Permission to publish, Judge?
Yes.
Can we approach one?
Yes?
Dr. Downs, can you tell me ultimately how Felicia Williams died?
She died as a result of manual strangulation.
Can you describe manual strangulation?
Briefly, it's a compression of the blood vessels in the neck that cause a lack of blood flow to the brain. That then affects the heart rate, and the individual's heart eventually stops beating, and they end up unconscious first, but eventually dead.
Typically, people think of strangulation as putting pressure around the throat and someone not being able to breathe. Is that, in fact, what strangulation is, or manual strangulation that you found in this case?
Basically, a hand around the neck is manual strangulation. You could also do it with the crook of the arm, but it's compressing actually the blood vessels rather than the airway. So it's a blood vessel phenomenon. Typically, it's usually not a airway issue.
Can you explain what asphyxiation is and how that is associated with strangulation?
Asphyxiation is the lack of adequate oxygen delivery to the tissues. So it's a broad term. There's several different types of asphyxiation. For instance, you can have low oxygen in the environment. So no oxygen comes in to start with. That's an environmental asphyxiation. You can have a foreign body blocking the windpipe, so no air flows through the windpipe to the lungs. That's choking. You can have the process that I'm talking about, strangulation. That's one type of compression of the vessels. You could also have a ligature, which is just a fancy way of saying a cord or a belt or something like that, compressing the blood vessels. That's also a strangulation. Then you can have chemical asphyxia, something like carbon monoxide, where carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin molecules in the blood, so the blood can't carry oxygen because it's blocked. You can also have cyanide, which goes to the cellular level and prevents getting oxygen that way.
Your findings in this case, looking at the major types, was it strangulation or compression of the vessels?
Yes. So the types are listed here. Environment, again, low or no oxygen. You actually can asphyxiate. Normally our room is 21% oxygen, 22%, something like that. If you drop it just 5% to 16% oxygen in the room, you can die from asphyxiation just from that little drop in oxygen, even though there's 75% of usual. Choking, again, is blocking the airway. Think about somebody getting a hot dog in the windpipe or something like that. That's choking. Strangulation is what we're talking about, compression of the blood vessels. And finally, the chemical can either be carbon monoxide, like I said, or at a cellular level.
Can you explain what this diagram shows and whether or not you in fact saw if this area is affected when manual strangulation is put upon an individual, inflicted upon an individual?
Sure. So let me explain what we're looking at first. This is the neck. And you see at the bottom of the screen two horizontal lines coming in. Those are the collarbones. And they're coming into, right at the middle, something down at the bottom. That's the breastbone. So if you come up, you'll see red, and then outside of the red on either side, you'll see blue. The blue represents the jugular veins. Deeper are the arteries, the carotid arteries here. So you can see the arrows indicating those. Between the two red lines, you'll see a white tube that kind of blends into the background. That's sitting right in front of the spine, the bony part of the spine. But if you come up, you'll see a little pinker area.
Judge, may he reposition himself so he can touch the screen
Absolutely.
and describe what he's talking about?
Thank
If you need to stand up, you can.
Thank you. So the carotid artery here, jugular vein here, same on the opposite side. The trachea, or the windpipe, runs right from the breastbone up into the neck. The area that's a little pinker here, that's called the cricoid cartilage. It looks like a signet ring. And above that is the thyroid cartilage. That's the Adam's apple. Above that is an area that's cartilage until we get older, then it calcifies, called the hyoid bone. That's a horseshoe shaped bone that sits right next to the thyroid cartilage. And the side view, you can see it a little bit better. The collarbone here, the windpipe coming up, the cricoid cartilage above that, the thyroid cartilage or the Adam's apple. And if you see in the back of that, you'll see these extensions. Those are called horns or cornu, medically. But the horns, superior horns, stick up and they just about touch that hyoid on the sides. Now again, to orient you, the things that look like marshmallows here, those are the bony parts of the vertebra. So that's deep in the neck. And the structures we're talking about sit almost touching that. The only thing in between is soft tissue in the esophagus.
And these, this area specifically on the neck, is this the area that is affected when manual strangulation is inflicted?
Yes, you could actually strangle someone anywhere that you see the blood vessels here. So theoretically, you could strangle somebody all the way down to the level of the collarbone. But more typically, it's up much higher in the area at and above the Adam's apple.
What's the difference between a vein and an artery?
Veins are low pressure. Arteries are high pressure. The heart pumps blood under pressure. That travels from the arteries, goes to the tissues. So in this case, to the brain. Gives oxygen to the brain. Brain takes the oxygen out, sends back the low oxygen blood through the vein. The veins drain back into the heart. The heart pumps it to the lungs. The lungs give it oxygen, and the whole cycle is repeated.
What are we looking at here, Dr. Downs?
All right, so the last one was the big scale, artery to vein. And I said blood gets from one to the other. This explains how that actually happens. So again, blood comes in the artery. The artery breaks down into little branches called arterioles, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually it crosses over in the capillaries. And the capillaries are the bridge between artery and vein. The blood, or the oxygen, is released somewhere in the middle of that capillary. Unoxygenated blood comes back. That's why it's turning blue, no oxygen, through the venules, which is a fancy word for small vein. Comes into the vein. From the vein, it goes back down to the heart.
And if compression is placed on these, either the vein or any of the vessels, what ultimately can happen?
Depends on how much pressure. If you close off the vein, then basically things are going to back up. Think about a toilet. I hate to use the analogy, but it makes sense. If you block the drain of the toilet, nothing leaves. So it basically, everything there is stuck there. If you have something coming in, that compounds your issue.
Can you explain, Doctor, what we are looking at here to orient ourselves?
This is a cross-section of the neck through the area of the Adam's apple. So that's the thyroid cartilage I just mentioned, and literally it's like I took a knife and just chopped my head off and laid it down so you could look into the tissues from above or below, depending on how you want to look at it.
Do you see the jugular vein and the carotid artery within this photograph?
Yes.
Can you please describe where they are?
Sure. So again, thyroid cartilage here. This is the area of the windpipe. The black part's the part that's open in the windpipe. If you keep going back, the esophagus is right there, and immediately behind that is the bony part of the spine. Those marshmallow-looking things that we had in the last picture. or 2 pictures ago. If you come out to the side, the artery is close to the bone. The jugular vein is outside that. So the jugular vein actually sits more closer to the surface. In some people, in some locations, it's all the way out. And you'll actually see that in some people, they'll get what we call jugular distension. And that's a fancy way of saying that you can see the veins on the sides of their neck.
Is this a photograph or the way it would look if no compression was being placed on any of the vessels?
Yes, this is just a generic demonstration of the anatomy to show you where everything is so that you have a better understanding of this concept of strangulation that I'm talking about.
And if there's no compression, blood is flowing the way it should in our bodies. Is that fair to say?
Should be, unless there's some other issue.
Does this diagram show when there is no compression?
Correct. And again, this is a different model or diagram, but it shows the blood vessels, the artery, and blood cells just flowing through, going over to the vein side after it leaves the capillaries. And then I've got the little arrows there that, I don't know if that has an animation there or not. The oxygenated blood comes in, the blood transfers, oxygen leaves, and then the unoxygenated blood continues. So artery, oxygen, capillaries, oxygen leaves, veins, deoxygenated blood goes back to the heart.
This is the neck anatomy that you had just described. The trachea up at the top, the
Correct.
esophagus with the red circle around it, the spine, which has a blue tint on it, and then the red is the carotid artery and the jugular vein. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Again, is this the way it would look if there was no compression?
Well, actually what this is doing is you've got the anatomy that I just described, but the yellow arrows that I added is to show force coming specifically to where the vessels are on the neck. Now, this showed the force coming from the back. The front of the body would be at the top of the screen. I'm not saying that at all. It's just how I animated the model so that all my arrows would fit. The important point here is there's pressure coming in on the sides of the vessels, the sides of the neck. So far, nothing's happened because there's no compression.
Is this the way the blood looks when it's flowing through without any compression?
Correct. You can see, I think there's an animation here. If you look at the carotid arteries, blood's pulsing in, it's going through the capillaries, and then it's going to come back through the veins. So that's normal. Nothing interfering at all.
Looking at the next slide, it appears that the blue that was previously marked as the jugular vein now appears not as a circle but as slits.
Correct. So now that pressure, the yellow arrows on the sides, has squeezed the veins closed. The arteries are still open.
And with the animation,
Blood is coming in. It's going into the blood vessels. And again, it's like the toilet. If something's coming in, it's got no place to go because it can't go back through those veins.
now for the manual strangulation, is it required that both sides of those vessels are compressed, or can manual strangulation be when only one side of the vessel is compressed?
It has to be both sides. We're built-in fail-safe, if you will. I actually have a friend that has one carotid completely blocked off. He's fine. You have the other side as a backup. So it takes both sides being compressed at the same time. So what this is intended to show is that the blood, I think there's also an animation here, the blood comes in and it's going through the capillaries, just like always. But again, it can't go out here. So for a while, you're okay. For a while, oxygen is flowing to the brain. But then something happens, which is the blood's coming in, and again, I think there's an animation. Oxygenated blood coming in, it's going through the capillary, But now the blue arrow, and you notice the right side of the screen here, none of those blood cells are moving because it's all backed up. So
When that happens, what happens to that blood that then gets stopped up?
So what I'm demonstrating here is all that blood has to go somewhere, and where it goes is to the point of least resistance. And again, it's like the toilet model. If water's flowing in with the supply line open, water's coming into the toilet, it can't go out. It goes where there's no resistance. It overflows. Really, the body does the same thing. The red blood cells here break the walls of the capillary and they go out into the tissue. So all the red blood cells go out into the tissues.
When you are then looking externally, can you, after someone has been inflicted with manual strangulation, are you able to see external remnants of this, where the blood has been stopped and is overflowing?
Yes. You see them diffusely, but they're more easily seen in certain locations. Those locations being the whites of the eyes, sometimes inside the lips, but they're going to be above that level of compression.
Can you also see them internally?
Yes. So this is showing the whites of the eyes here. Those little red dots are what we call petechial, which is a fancy way of saying pinpoint. Bleeds in the whites of the eyes. And why those are there is the capillaries are easily visible in the whites of the eyes because you got good background, you got good contrast so you can see it. What happens is those capillaries break, the blood cells leak out into the tissues, and that's how you end up with those little red dots in the whites of the eyes in strangulation cases.
Is the petechiae and within the whites of the eyes and the eyelids just one symptom of manual strangulation or one result of manual strangulation?
Yes, that's one of the findings that we see. One of the anatomic findings is that petechial bleeding. There's several others. In a manual strangulation, I'm looking mainly for internal findings because I may not see these petechial hemorrhages. If I see them, I feel really confident in my diagnosis, but they don't have to be there.
Can you explain how the compression occurs, or how you believed it to have occurred in this case, looking at your findings?
Basically what happens is there's a compression, and the amount of force is important. These are from research. It's not exactly correct in a specific case, but for teaching purposes, these are the amounts of force that research has shown us it takes. It takes about 5-6 pounds of pressure to close off the jugular vein. That means the carotid artery is still open because the carotid artery takes about 10 or 12 pounds of pressure to close that off. It takes about 30 pounds of pressure or more, 35, to close off the windpipe. So that's a pretty significant amount of force. And then there's another artery that's very deep called the vertebral artery. That takes a lot more force than what we're talking about, like 60, 70 pounds of pressure. The main point here is with somewhere between 5 pounds and 10 pounds of pressure, blood can't leave, but it's flowing in. So that's the kind of cases where we'll get petechial hemorrhages. If you have more than 10 pounds of pressure, less than 30, the arteries are closed off, nothing's coming in. So it's like, again, back to the toilet model, you turn the valve off so water's not coming in. Nothing happens. It stops. Here we're talking about between 5-6 pounds and 10-12 pounds of pressure.
When you were talking about compression or manual strangulation, you're using one hand. In this case, were you able to tell whether the manual strangulation was due to one hand or two hands around the victim's neck in this case?
That's not possible for me to say. I'm demonstrating one hand just because it's easier to do that. I could just as easily show you two hands. The main thing is it's the compression of the blood vessels.
And looking at approximately 5 to 6 pounds compared to 60 or 70 pounds doesn't seem like all that much, but these veins that you previously described, they are covered by skin and layers of muscle, and they are deep within the body. Is that correct?
I hesitate to say they're deep within the body because the neck, if you think about the neck as compartments, we have an area where the blood vessels exist that's a little deeper than the surface, but not as deep as the windpipe, and certainly not as deep as the spine. So medically speaking, I wouldn't exactly call them deep. They're underneath the skin surface, but they're not readily accessible normally. That is, unless something breaks the border of the jaw and gets into that space that's recessed, those vessels are undisturbed.
Are they on the outside of the neck muscles or under the neck muscles?
They are both, really, depending on where you are and what you're talking about. The neck has multiple different muscle layers. And as part of doing a forensic autopsy in a case like this, I'm going to go through and dissect away the individual muscles to look at the blood that's there.
And are you able to
Or
tell?
not there. Sorry.
Is how deep the injury or the petechial bleeds or hemorrhaging that you found? Are you able to determine which force was required or which force could have caused those injuries?
I can tell by the presence of petechial bleeds that at some point you had a subtotal occlusion of the blood vessels. What I mean by that is you close off the veins, the arteries stay open. There could have been a period where the arteries were completely occluded, so no blood would come in. But I know because I have petechiae, I had to have a sufficient amount of time, and it does take, it's not instantaneous, it takes a while, for blood to be coming in from the arteries, not leaving by the veins. And another point is you can have multiple episodes. In fact, in sexual homicides, you oftentimes will have someone who occludes the blood vessels so the victim becomes unconscious, releases the pressure, the victim comes to, they do it again. And they do the same thing, they occlude the veins, release it, the person becomes conscious again, and they'll keep doing that.
Within the victim in this case, did you see injury to the muscles within her neck?
Quite a bit, more than I usually see in strangulated cases, actually.
Can you explain how the neck muscles are within our body and how many neck muscles we have?
So again, get you oriented. The breastbone is right in the middle of the bottom. The clavicles or the collarbones are coming in on the sides at the bottom. The first muscle that's right underneath the skin is called the Sternocleidomastoid. And I know that sounds complicated, but anatomy is actually sometimes pretty simple. Unfortunately, this is one of those times where it's fairly simple. Sternum. So it goes from the breastbone. Cleido means collarbone. That's this part of that same muscle coming to the collarbone. Mastoid is that big bony prominence behind and under the ear. So this muscle runs from the mastoid to the clavicle and the sternum.
Did you see injury to that muscle upon reviewing this case?
Yes. The next layer underneath would be the sternohyoid. The hyoid, remember, is that horseshoe-shaped bone that sits above the Adam's apple cartilage. So it goes, sternohyoid goes from the sternum to the hyoid. Then next to that is something called the omohyoid, which comes out to the shoulder. This is actually a long one, and there's two separate parts to it. The inferior part comes from the shoulders to the midline and then goes up to the hyoid. These on the sides, this is where those names kind of get a little weird. This is called the scalene muscle. That's a much deeper muscle. This middle picture shows you the sternohyoid as well as the omohyoid here. Those other muscles that aren't involved in this case.
Doctor, let me stop you for a minute. Did you see injury to the sternohyoid and omohyoid on Felicia Williams?
I need to actually check my notes. I know it's in my presentation later on.
May I push for a moment?
Sure. So there's bleeding in the omohyoid, and we'll get to some other hemorrhages a little later.
As well as in the sternohyoid?
Correct. So beneath the Sternohyoid is the Sternothyroid. So that's right beneath. It goes from the sternum to the thyroid. Below that is the longus colli, which is a muscle that runs on the front of the spine, deep inside the neck, all the way up against bone. So that one I would call deep. There's also other muscle layers, the thyrohyoid, which goes from the thyroid to the hyoid, the cricothyroid, and then there's several other smaller muscles. And multiple of these individual muscle layers had individual discrete bleeds. And again, more than I would typically see in a strangulation case. I'm used to seeing 2, 3, 4, and in here there were multiple.
When an autopsy is conducted, are you able to examine and look at all of these different layers of the muscle, and are all they dissected and examined?
Yes, they are. Actually, it's a very specific procedure that we do, because what we don't want to do as pathologists is we don't want to introduce questions. We don't want to introduce artifacts. So the way you do a proper neck dissection is layer by layer, and that should be the last thing that the pathologist does is dissect the neck. That is, all the organs come out of the body cavities, the brain comes out, then we'll start doing the neck dissection and do that layer by layer.
The muscles that we just saw and went over, are they surrounding these areas?
Yes. They're investing or covering the muscles, the thyroid cartilage. They're in front and on the sides of all of this.
Specifically, when you have manual strangulation, do you always have a fracture of any of these bones or cartilage?
Not usually in children, because their cartilages aren't calcified. As we get older, all our cartilage will start calcifying. Some people, it happens later than others, but for instance, the collarbones, where they join the breastbone, that's cartilage until we get about 50 or 60, and then that'll calcify and it'll become one unit. But young kids, their hyoid is all cartilage. It's soft, it's pliable, and actually it's got joints. It's got a joint on the left side as well as on the right side in the front. So the bottom of that horseshoe, there's joints on either side of that. So it's very pliable. I would not expect to find fractures there.
So your findings weren't inconsistent with regards to manual strangulation in a 9-year-old, since you did not find any fractures in this area?
No, they were consistent with strangulation.
Can you describe what the temporalis muscle is and where it is?
So on the right side of this picture, you see the skull. And the cheekbone goes back to right where the ear canal is. And that area that I'm indicating is where the temporalis muscle sits. The temporalis muscle basically, for a strangulation case, is important because oftentimes there's hemorrhage specifically at that site. It happens by a different mechanism, and we're not exactly sure how it is or why it is, but that specific site, very often in strangulation cases, will have hemorrhage in it, as it was in this case.
And can that sometimes often be mistaken if you do see injury there, that one may determine that it was caused by blunt force impact when in fact it was caused by manual strangulation?
I have seen many pathologists, lesser experienced or maybe just don't know, confuse that blood for a different type of injury. In fact, it's not. It's part of the strangulation process.
Let's move on to speaking specifically about Miss Williams in this case. You were provided, I believe, previously you testified with the autopsy report
That's
that was
correct.
prepared by Dr. Kurz out of Pinellas County.
That's correct.
And this initial information that you've documented with regards to the date that the body was found on May 17th of 2014 and the day the exam was done on the 18th at 11:14 a.m. Were those, is this all information that you retrieved from that report?
That's correct.
And you also learned that Felicia Williams was a 9-year-old and that she was 58 inches long and 121 pounds.
That's correct.
Now that weight, if someone is found within water, could their weight be affected at all?
It certainly could be. It would be more so if somebody had clothes on, which she did not, because the water would get into the clothing. So what you want as a pathologist is to get a nude weight.
And based upon your training experience, was she within normal limits or not within normal limits for her age?
She was within normal for her age. It was high normal, but normal.
Let's start with looking at externally injuries that were observed and documented on Felicia Williams. Can you explain where they were seen externally?
Externally, there were petechial, again, means pinpoint, and some of those areas in the whites of the eye specifically, the petechial pinpoint bleeds came together. So technically they're not pinpoint, which is why I said small bleeds. Those happened in the whites of the eyes, called the conjunctiva, as well as the inside of the eyelids. And those range from 2 millimeters up to 8 millimeters on the right, and about a half a centimeter on the left. And there were additional injuries to the genital area that we'll come back to.
Internally, were there multiple areas where hemorrhage or bleeds were observed?
There were.
And how is it that you observed these?
They're documented in the autopsy report as well as in the photographs that I saw of the autopsy. There was hemorrhage into the temporalis muscles, multiple areas in the neck, the shoulders, the tongue. There were bleeds inside the chest cavity, as well as bleeds underneath the scalp or in the scalp and on the back.
And is the intrathoracic area, is that the chest cavity area?
That's correct.
How is it that with manual strangulation the tongue can be injured or show hemorrhage?
It's not directly related with the strangulation process. Again, that process is the neck vessels. But if someone is being strangled, it's an unpleasant sensation. The body has a reflex, actually, when we start losing oxygen and building up carbon dioxide, called air hunger. So we know that this is not a pleasant process to be deprived of oxygen. People get panicked. Additionally, if you're being involuntarily having your neck vessels occluded, you might cry out, you might scream, you might be slapped around a little bit and bite your tongue. That may be part of the process. It may also happen in the period when you are basically becoming unconscious, or if you have seizure-like activity in the process of dying.
We've been talking about the word hemorrhage and using that. Can you explain what hemorrhage means?
Hemorrhaging is basically a fancy way of saying bleeding.
And are all of these internal injuries that are listed here, were they all due to strangulation, or were some of them caused by other inflicted force?
Others were caused by blunt force of other types.
Can you explain, again, so the eyes you could see externally. Were they also visibly internally when the autopsy was conducted of the eye area?
Right. And this is a little bit of a technical point, but the bleeds inside the eyelids You don't really see those externally, so I included that in both places here, just for clarity. But the other area internally would be the larynx, which is the windpipe. The mucus lining of that, the mucous membrane lining of that also had bleeding, pinpoint bleeding there.
And are these consistent still with manual strangulation?
Yes.
When we were briefly discussing the muscles previously, you noted that there were numerous areas of hemorrhage within her neck. Is this the list of the areas in which you observe hemorrhage?
That's correct. I believe it's a total of 9 separate areas.
And all of them, except for the last one, they were, when we looked at the diagram, the frontal diagram, the hyoid, the cricoid, all the muscles surrounding all of this area. Is that correct?
That's correct. The bottom one is the muscle that's all the way up against the spine, but everything else is from the sternocleidomastoid, the first one that I talked about, all the way down to the windpipe itself.
And again, this area is, these are the muscles, the neck muscles that you previously reviewed, and these are the sternocleidomastoid, the omohyoid, the hyoid, the sternohyoid, all of those areas you in fact saw hemorrhage.
Correct.
Including the cervical spine area, the longus colli.
Correct.
Now, was that towards the front of the, or in the back of the neck?
That muscle is right next to the spine, so it's in the front of the neck, but it's deep. If you remember, I said you consider the neck to have different compartments, with the blood vessels being superficial. You've got kind of the windpipe in the middle, and then up against the spine is deep.
Continuing on to other hemorrhages that you saw, can you explain these areas within the body and how they relate to the other page of the listed injuries?
So the laryngeal mucosa, that's the larynx is basically the beginning of the windpipe, and the mucosa there has pinpoint bleeds. Those can happen from several different mechanisms. It's a little different mechanism than the compression that we talked about causing bleeding from the capillaries. Here, what happens is with the choking process, somebody struggling to breathe, their windpipe closes off. The epiglottis is a flap that'll close off and block the windpipe. But if someone's got negative pressure and they're struggling to breathe, that negative pressure, which normally just keeps our lungs inflated, can become so pronounced that the small blood vessels, the capillaries, break. So it's a little different process here because it's related more to the trying to breathe and not being able to, rather than the direct tearing of capillaries.
And the temporalis muscle, that was the area that we previously reviewed, just above the ear area. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there was hemorrhage on both sides. Is that correct?
That's correct. Fairly significant, 2 inches and about 2.5 inches on the right.
Do you typically see hemorrhage on both sides with manual strangulation?
Yes.
And is that because both sides requires the compression for the manual strangulation?
Again, we're not exactly clear why this bleeding happens. We know that it does. So I can't tell you that it's the compressional process. I can only tell you that we see it.
Have you seen it where it's only been on one side with manual strangulation?
Not that I recall. I would say theoretically it's possible. I just don't recall having seen it.
In the intrathoracic bleeds, what area did you observe those bleeds?
They were on the thymus gland, which is a lymphatic organ that sits right behind the upper part of the breastbone. So on the surface of that, and also on the surface of the heart.
So all all along her neck, leading down into the chest area. You saw hemorrhage?
Different processes. Again, this is a very non-specific finding. I see this in lots of different types of death. It's not directly associated with asphyxiation or strangulation, although it's common to see them with those types of deaths. I see this sometimes in drug overdose cases. I'll see them sometimes in other types of deaths. But there were separate bleeds removed and inside the chest cavity that were separate and different from the bleeds that were in the neck. So two different processes going on. They may be related, but I can't tell you absolutely that they were.
What is the epicardium?
Epicardium is the surface of the heart. Epi is outside or surface, and cardium, heart.
And the intra, if you could assist me with that word.
The intrathoracic or intraparenchymal.
Yes.
Sorry, we like to use big words, I guess. I apologize. Intraparenchymal means intra into parenchyma tissue, so into the tissue bleeds of the tongue. There was a bleed in the middle of the tongue tip, and then a bleed a little more than a half an inch on the right side of the tongue.
And again, is this documenting, again, the temporalis muscle that is typically, you see hemorrhage consistent with manual strangulation?
Correct. And again, I'm just showing one side, but here it was on both sides.
Can you explain, you briefly discussed that you saw a lot of artifact externally on the victim's body. Are these the areas in which you saw, well, let's first start with what is artifact?
Artifact is, it is an injury, but it's an artificial injury. It's not real. We spend a lot of time in training in forensic pathology learning to distinguish the real from the not real, or to be able to say, I don't know. Because there's sometimes you just don't know. So artifact is something that, wow, there's something going on here, but it's not real. It's not something that was associated with the person's death. It's basically ignore this.
And do you have an opinion as to how these, how this artifact was caused based upon your review of the file?
Yes.
And what is that?
The body was disposed of in water and recovered near the shore with a rocky area. And I believe that the wave motion combined with the environment the body was in, as well as any aquatic life, crabs, shrimp, fish, they're drawn to injuries. They're drawn to body openings. So we're used to seeing that. We're used to seeing that happen in the mouth. We're used to seeing that happen in the eyes. That would be an artifact. But
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
Here, the major injuries would be the surface injuries that are visible from the face, again, all the way down the front of her body, stopping somewhere a little below the belly button. And then there's scattered other similar type of injuries.
Were you provided photographs of the scene and where Felicia's body was in fact located?
I was.
Okay. And is this document, or is this one of the photographs that you were provided with regards to where her body was located?
It is.
And so the artifact and the areas that you noted, you believe were caused by these rocks that are located within this photograph, as well as potential marine life.
Correct. You've got this rocky area, barnacles, oysters, that type of thing. It's a saltwater environment. But the wave action primarily is affecting the areas that are up against that rocky area. You can see that her extremity is down. It looks like her arm is coming across here. So it's, I don't want to say anchoring, but kind of keeping her body steady in that general environment. Legs are out in the open area. Head is to the right in this photograph. You can see her hair.
And is it important for you, in order to come to your opinion, that you know the circumstances surrounding where the body was found and how the body was found in order to come to your ultimate opinion or render an opinion?
Absolutely. That's one of the first lessons that I learned from Dr. Davis when I was in Miami. Everything hinges on the scene. It all is driven by the scene. So that's a critical part of analysis and looking at a case, is to understand the scene environment.
Dr. Downs, is this a close-up of artifact that you observed on about the head of Felicia Williams, or the face?
It is artifact as well as some other areas that I'm attributing to artifact. If I could explain that?
Yes, so if you could explain why, I guess when you were previously talking about artifact, you made the statement, if we don't know, we don't know. So in your position, are you making guesses about what you think may have caused that, or do you not do that? Have you been trained not to do that?
I've been specifically trained not to do that. That's something that's called cognitive bias. If you think you're going to see something, so you pat yourself on the back when you figure out what it is that you thought it was all along. So we specifically guard against that because it's very dangerous in medicine to have tunnel vision. You go into a thing and looking at it one way and only one way. And one of the important lessons you learn, again, I learned this from Dr. Davis in Miami, is you don't know everything. And if you don't know, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. There are things that, to me, are suspicious, but they're not documented. So I have to say, I'm going to say that that's an artifact. I may have another opinion, but I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. So I'm going to say I don't know.
Can you describe what we're looking specifically at here in these photographs?
The left side of the screen is Felicia's nose and mouth area and the cheeks next to the mouth. On the right side, the inside of the upper lip and the inside of the lower lip.
Are you able to tell? It appears in the bottom, it would be her right side of her lip, a darkened red color. Do you have an opinion as to that area?
Are you referring to this?
Yes, the bottom.
That's the left side.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, on both sides.
You can see a dark area over here as well. To me, I see it more prominently on her left, our right. But that's the area, the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I see a dark area there. My first thought is, could that be an injury? Bruises are dark. It's not described. I don't know. So I'm not going to say it's a bruise. I'm going to say I don't know. It's an area that I would not be surprised to see an injury from someone who has had an altercation. It makes sense. Somebody gets punched in the face. But I can't say, so I don't know. In the middle here, there's roughened areas that we call abrasions. Abrasion is a type of blunt force injury. If you fall on the sidewalk and skin your knee, that's an abrasion. So here I see abrasions. That is a typical finding in cases of suffocation. That is where you, for example, put your hand over mouth, nose, and occlude the airway that way. Because she has all this other injury, the white areas here, she's obviously got dark skin, except there's areas here that you don't have pigment in. The reason is because that skin surface where the pigment lives has been rubbed away. So all of this is artifact. You've got little superficial incisions scattered across. Again, artifact. My concern here is I look at the mouth, I see a darker area here that could be blood. I specifically don't see this type of finding here. I do see something maybe on the lips, but that's right over the area inside. So I can't say. It's in the right area to be a real injury, but I'm not going to call it a real injury. I can't say.
So it could possibly be consistent with someone holding their hand over her mouth, or could it have been caused by blunt force trauma, but you're not able to say?
Both, and I would say forcibly holding their hand against the mouth.
Moving on, this photograph depicts the front and part of the shoulder area of the victim. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you describe what you believe to be artifact, and or whether or not you see any injury looking simply just externally?
So everything that I see here, I would attribute to artifact. There is a larger defect here on the forehead and a larger defect over here by the eye. As we'll see later on, there is some blood underneath this area. But I think this external injury could well be artifact.
And you have, when you go through an autopsy and review it, could you not make that a determination as to whether or not that was in fact artery or injury until you looked into the internal injuries or the inside of the body?
Sure, that's why we do autopsies, is to literally, the word means to see for yourself. So I can look at the outside and I formulate working hypotheses, or in medicine we call them a differential diagnosis. That is, all of these things it might be. And then as I go through doing the course of the autopsy, I include or exclude the things on my list, and I may have other things that come on as I get into the body and I find other things. So, yeah, I mean, it's part of doing the autopsy process.
Now it appears that on her left shoulder compared to her right shoulder, there is more scraping. Do you have any opinion as to, does it appear that her body then on the left side was scraping up more on that rocky area than the right side?
Well, if you remember the scene photograph, I believe she was face down, and I believe I made a point of her right arm extending out. And what I said was not anchoring, but kind of keeping her stationary. That could well explain why that area doesn't have the significant injuries that we see on the left side. Some other
I apologize.
points of that. No, there's some other important stuff in this photograph, I think, that are relevant. You'll notice that the parts of the body that stick out are injured. The nose. But notice just a quarter-inch away, because it's a recessed area. There's nothing there. Notice the eyes. A quarter-inch away, a recessed area. Nothing there. I think that's important here.
All right. Before we start moving on, it's 5:01. I've got to let this jury eat lunch. Okay.
Sure.
So we are going to take a quick lunch break today. We have a number of expert witnesses that need to testify. So we're going to reconvene at 1:45. All right. So please remember my previous instructions. Don't discuss this case with anyone while you're on break. Don't listen to, watch, read any news accounts. Do any independent investigations. See you all back here at 1:45.
All rise, jury exiting.
Okay, jury's at the courtroom. Dr. Down, since you are on the witness stand and have not yet been cross-examined during the break, you can't talk to anyone, including the prosecutors, about anything related to